Today from the global lane, the Ayatollah, Islam, and war. Iranians get closer to the breaking point. Is change coming?
The people of Iran don't want this regime. Democratic change in Iran is not only inevitable, but also can be achieved in the short future.
Iranians reject theocracy, leave Islam, and find Christ.
Jesus is revealing himself. Christian radio broadcasts, Christian television broadcasts, Christian internet ministries are feeding into that hunger in Iran, and we're seeing this massive wave of people come to Christ.
On the home front, American college students prepare to return to campus. But what are they returning to? Protests and leftist thinking?
We're teaching them to be ideologues and radical activists, and we see the results. The students are incapable of actually integrating into the workforce, and they're going to be a problem.
And it's 14 years of hard labor for this Orthodox priest for defying Putin in Ukraine. And it's all right here on the global lane. Avoiding a bigger war in the Middle East. The United States is warning Iran against escalating the conflict with Israel. Has U.S. Middle East policy led to this moment? And what approach is more likely to help cooler heads prevail? Well, joining us is Dr. Majid Sadikpur. He's Iranian-American human rights activist and political director of the Organization of Iranian American Communities. Dr. Sadikpur, it's good to have you with us. Iran's blaming the United States. They call us the Great Satan, of course, for supporting Israel in its war with Hamas. Iran claims that Israel would never have taken that risk of assassinating Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh if the U.S. hadn't provided the IDF with weapons. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the regime in Iran has been at war with humanity since its inception. Let me get back to the very early part of the 1980s when the regime in Iran began persecution of the Iranian people and essentially waged war on the people of Iran that has continued to this day. The carnage that you see outside of Iran, particularly in the Middle East at the moment, is really part and parcel of two things. One, a strategic framework built by the regime in Iran because it knew it had no legitimacy within the country. It didn't have the support of its people. And so it created a framework outside of Iran through creation of terrorist organizations and proxies across the region so that it could essentially handcuff foreign policy of Western nations. A second thing is that, as you mentioned in your intro, the global community, Western nations, have bought into the process as if the regime in Iran is reformable. So our Western decision-making has been aimed at changing the Ayatollah's behavior to what we consider powerful and moderate.
Why have we failed to challenge them?
Excellent. Well, the first strategic framework the regime is built, meaning blackmailing the free world by terrorism, has worked. It has really created a significant amount of hesitation for the free world to confront Iran.
And now with nuclear weapons, right?
That is correct. But the fundamental reason is that we have not, as of right now, as the U.S. policy has not accepted the framework that the people of Iran don't want this regime. In other words, on the one, there is a contrast between what the international community thinks is happening inside Iran, whereas what the people of Iran are telling us is happening. In other words, the people of Iran have been dying at the highest per capita execution rate in the world. I just used last year's number, 2023. Iran executed north of 850 people, publicly, in other words, acknowledged executions. That is 74% of all global executions that were carried out. But Iran only has 1% of the global population. That speaks to a population that is trying to overthrow the regime, but it's got an enormous headwind. The headwind is the international community continuing to engage the regime. Yes, there is also a headwind of the regime killing and persecuting the Iranian people. But if you remove that, if we remove the first one, which is the international community finally making the decision to say goodbye to this regime diplomatically, to actually put pressure on the regime that matters, to hold its leaders accountable for rights violations and terrorism, truly hold them accountable.
Well, do you see that happening in the future here? We've got an election coming up in the U.S., so who would do a better job of responding to Iran and managing American policy on the Middle East, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, and why?
I don't know the answer to that fully. I would have to say, I do know that whoever is in the White House has no choice but to make sure that they hold Iran accountable for its behavior, both inside and outside of it. I must add one thing. One of the reasons the free world, and certainly the United States, has not pursued a policy of democratic regime change. What I meant by that is that relying on the Iranian people to make that change is that we don't think there is an alternative. But there is an alternative, to use former Vice President Mike Pence's words specifically. There is an organized opposition inside and outside, led by the National Council of Resistance in Iran, with a didactic, clearly specified plan for the future of Iran. Should we remove our perpetual engagement with the regime and pressure the regime, as we should, and express political and moral support for the Iranian people's right to overthrow this regime, and give that the political legitimacy it deserves, democratic change in Iran is not only inevitable, but also can be achieved in the short future.
Well, we'll see if there's a policy change. Dr. Majid Sadikpur, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. We appreciate it.
Of course.
Amidst wars and rumors of bigger conflicts in the Middle East region, there is some good news. An unprecedented number of Muslims are choosing to follow Christ. In Iran, 50,000 out of 75,000 mosques have closed, as 80% of Iranians express their dissatisfaction with the government and their desire to see democracy replace it. Todd Nettleton, Vice President of Messaging at the Voice of the Martyrs and VOM radio host, joins us now. Todd, it seems many Iranians are seeking to overcome their displeasure with the regime by embracing Christ. So tell us what you and VOM have learned about what is happening now inside Iran.
Well, one of the things that's happened since 1979 is the government of Iran has been the mullahs. It's been the Islamic leaders, and they have made this claim that, hey, we are running our country according to Islamic principles. We're going to follow the Quran down to a T. We're going to run everything in the country just the way Islam tells us to. Well, we're now 45 years into that little experiment. And you have a country with one of the highest drug addiction rates in the world. You have a country where corruption runs rampant. You have a country where more than half the people live below the poverty line. And the people of Iran are looking at this and they're saying, wait a minute, if this is what Islam has brought us in the last 45 years, we're not interested. We want to know what the other options are. That's why so many Iranians, the first step typically is to reject Islam and to reject religion. And many of them have become atheists. But then the second step is, well, wait a minute, what if there is a God? And that is how Jesus is revealing himself. Christian radio broadcast, Christian television broadcast, Christian internet ministries are feeding into that hunger in Iran. And we're seeing this massive wave of people come to Christ.
How's the regime reacting to this? We've heard 50,000 of 75,000 mosques have closed, and I'm sure they aren't accepting that very well.
No, this is not something that is making the regime happy. And really, in many ways, they are seeking to solidify their power and to crush any kind of dissent. And they certainly see the growth of the church. They certainly see Christian evangelism as a form of dissent. That's undermining the Islamic regime. And so you have Christians being arrested, particularly leaders. We have heard multiple stories this year of a Bible study, a home church being raided. Everyone there is photographed, everyone there is questioned, but then the leader of the meeting is held onto. They are arrested, they are detained, they're put in prison. And so there really is a concerted effort to go after the leaders and the people who are spreading Christianity and inviting other Muslims to come and follow Christ.
And how about relatives, friends, that kind of thing of Muslims who do convert to Christ? Those people are considered apostates, right? Those who do convert. So what happens to them aside from the government?
Well, it's interesting. I've asked that question to Iranian Christian leaders, and one of the factors there, and in most Muslim countries, the first line of persecution is your family. They're the first people who are going to come to you and say, "Wait a minute, we're a Muslim family. You can't be part of our family if you're not a Muslim anymore." That is less likely to happen in Iran because so many Iranians have rejected Islam, or at least they're open to the idea of rejecting Islam. And so oftentimes, rather than your family coming and persecuting you, they come to you and say, well, hey, if that works for you, okay, we're okay with it. We won't bother you. Because again, so many Iranians don't think Islam works. They see what their government has done over the last 45 years. And so they're kind of have the attitude of, hey, if you found something that works for you, if it's Jesus or if it's atheism or if it's whatever, if it works for you, I know Islam doesn't work. So I'm happy you found something that works. So it is different as far as family persecution in Iran from what you might see in Saudi Arabia or what you might see in another predominantly Muslim country.
Well, where else are we seeing explosive Christian growth in the Middle East? Which country excites you the most right now beyond Iran?
As we look across the Middle East, I think of things in Saudi Arabia. The government, certainly in Saudi Arabia, is changing in terms of how it responds to outside influence. There is an effort to sort of modernize the business world. There is an effort to be more friendly to the rest of the world, more open to the rest of the world. And it seems like there is a little more openness to the idea of Christianity coming into Saudi Arabia, not necessarily welcoming it with open arms, obviously, but just the understanding that it could happen, that there could be Christians here, and maybe that's not the worst thing in the world.
So what can Christians worldwide do to help these new believers in Iran and elsewhere, Todd?
I think the first thing that we need to do, that all of us can do, is to pray for them. And I think that's the first thing they would ask us to do as well. There are also ministries like the Voice of the Martyrs that are supporting the church in Iran, that are helping to equip. One of the things you can pray for, and one of the things that Voice of the Martyrs is involved in, is training up leaders. As the church is growing so quickly, one of the first things they need is more leaders. And so helping to identify, helping to train, helping to equip those leaders is a key part of the ministry to support the growth of the church in Iran.
Okay, and we'll keep praying for them as well. Todd Nettleton, the Voice of the Martyrs. Thank you, Todd, for sharing your insights. We appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's back to college soon for millions of young Americans, but what are they going back to? More pro-Hamas demonstrations, blocking access to classes, more leftist indoctrination from extremist professors? Well, joining us to share some insights is Nicholas Giordano. He's Campus Reform Higher Education Fellow and Professor of Political Science at Suffolk Community College in New York. Nicholas, it's good to have you with us again. So parents and students paying exorbitant amounts of money for higher education. So what are they getting for their investment this fall? What do you see happening?
Well, we see the increasing radicalization going on, and I don't think parents want to spend, anywhere from $40,000 to $90,000 per year for their children to come home indoctrinated. Radical extremism. Since 2009, Campus Reform has been reporting on the increasing extremism that we're witnessing. And we see it with the October 7th Hamas terror attacks. That's where it began to get even worse, where you had students and faculty members talk about the October 7th attacks as exhilarating. One professor labeled it awesome, and they called for October 7th 10,000 more times. We hear slogans of death to America, death to Israel. And then you fast forward to the assassination attempt on President Trump, and several professors have put out social media posts hoping for copycat attacks, wishing that the bullet actually hit President Trump in the head and killed him. And I don't think parents want their students in the classroom with these radicals.
Well, as you mentioned, one example of the extremist views professors share with students, including Berkeley College professor Marty Walsh, who commented on the attempted assassination of former President Trump, saying, "Too bad the shooter missed." What effect do remarks like that have on young, impressionable minds, Nicholas?
Well, it's disgraceful, and we're actually seeing the results in real time. We put out an article where 30% of Gen Zers actually are sympathetic to Osama bin Laden and his ideology. I mean, that's staggering. Osama bin Laden perpetrated the worst attack on U.S. soil, killing nearly 3,000 innocent civilians. We have over 5,000 plus dead from the 9/11 related injuries that they sustained at the cleanup sites. And yet 30% of Gen Zers now believe that Osama bin Laden had the right ideas. So we're cultivating an atmosphere, an environment where Americans are actually being taught to despise America, that they're being fed this anti-Americanism, and we cannot survive as a nation when our students are being taught to hate the United States.
What other examples do you have of hateful rhetoric on campus to share with us?
Well, we see it all the time. Conservatives are largely marginalized. I mean, the Leadership Institute's Briley Gaines was assaulted by giving speeches on campus. We see constantly when there's conservative speakers, Christian speakers going to college campuses, that leftist organizations will surround the speakers. They will disrupt the speakers and try and shut them down from speaking. So we're seeing increasing engagement on the ground on college campuses, particularly at the Ivy League universities, where they've become hostile to any speech that goes against their narrow points of view. And a lot of this has to do with some of the professors that are teaching the students in the classroom.
Well, I remember when I was in high school, teachers shared their anti-Vietnam War views with students. A little bit of that when I was in college, too. But mostly in college, it then became anti-apartheid. This seems different, though. How does it differ today?
Well, and I hear the same things. When I went to college, I had professors that were actually avowed Marxists, but they respected the institution of education, and they respected differing points of view. They loved to have the back and forth in class. They loved to hear what the other side was talking about. They loved the pushback. Today's professors are radical ideologues. They're not educators. And many of them that are in the classroom aren't experts in the subject material, and so they substitute their ideology, their radicalism, and that's what we see today. It really is disgraceful, because that's not what education's supposed to be about. We're supposed to be cultivating a student body to think critically, to problem solve, and then we're going to send them off to become assets to their communities, to become productive workers, to become productive citizens that understand the United States. Today, it's the exact opposite. We're teaching them to be ideologues and radical activists, and we see the results. At Google, for instance, you started to see people protesting in support of Hamas, and Google quickly fired those employees, said that this is a place of business, not one where political ideology should be tossed around. And so we are seeing that employers are starting to notice. They have announced that they won't be hiring students from certain schools because they're worried about the extremists, and they see that the students are incapable of actually integrating into the workforce, and that they're going to be a problem. And that's the fastest way to nip this in the bud, is when employers begin to turn their backs on these universities, parents stop sending their children to radical universities, and the donor class, the alumni, cuts off all donations to the endowments. That will be the fastest movement, where these colleges and institutions will be forced to quickly respond to this type of extremism that we're witnessing.
Money talks. He who pays gets the say, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, Professor Nicholas Giordano, Campus Reform Higher Education Fellow, thank you for sharing your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Russia's illegal war against churches, pastors, and priests in eastern Ukraine intensifies. Just days ago, the Russian-controlled Crimean Supreme Court handed down a 14-year prison sentence of hard labor to Ukrainian Orthodox priest Konstantin Maximov. Russian occupation forces arrested Maximov a year ago and charged him with espionage, violating Article 276 of the Russian Criminal Code. By demanding allegiance to their code, the Russians are violating international law, because Russia cannot enforce its laws in another country, in this case, while occupying Ukraine. According to Forum 18, Maximov was arrested because he resisted the efforts of the Russian Orthodox Church to take over the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Berdansk Diocese. Last February, another Ukrainian Orthodox priest, 59-year-old Stepan Poldichuk, was last seen as Russian troops put a bag over his head and dragged him away. 2 days later, Poldichuk was found dead with a bullet hole in his head in the streets of a village in the Kherson region. And no word has been heard from outspoken Ukrainian Orthodox priest Timofey Pushkov since his arrest on June 20th. He lives in the Russian-occupied Luhansk region of Ukraine. He often posts videos like this one on YouTube talking about the Christian response to war. The Russians are also persecuting Protestants. Again, according to Forum 18, a Protestant woman in her early 50s named Olena could face a prison sentence of 10 years for remarks she made against the Russian occupation during a prayer meeting in a home in Russian-occupied Melitopol. That is typical behavior for the Russians. Pastor Mark Sergeyev of the Melitopol Christian Church says Russian occupation forces raided his church and home in March 2022.
They took me outside, put on the ground. My oldest son was at that moment, his name is Christopher, he was 9 years old. He was sleeping in a different room and they wake him up with a gun.
Sergeyev says the troops insisted that the church was now part of Russia, and they wanted its members to wave Russian flags, not Ukrainian ones. Igor Bandura of the Ukrainian Baptist Union explains Putin's actions remind him of the old Soviet days when he lived under communism.
There is no place for evangelical churches and other churches except Russian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. All the rest should just disappear.
Folks, the world must hold Vladimir Putin and the Russian government accountable for what is happening to churches and their leaders in occupied Ukraine. They're violating international law, and it must stop. In the meantime, please pray for Ukraine and the body of Christ there, Orthodox and Protestants alike. Konstantin Maximov, Timofey Pushkov, and Protestant prayer warrior Olena sure could use some divine intervention right now. May they feel our prayers, and may God encourage them and bring them peace. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Be sure to follow us on the CBN News and NRB channels, YouTube, Spotify, and Rumble. And until next time, be blessed.